Mob Wars, Chicago versus the Cartel. The city of Chicago may always take the lead in the United States in terms of violence. If it is not gangs beefing and shooting, it's cartels sprawling out of their drug corners to mark territories with other cartels. While all of these are more than enough to deal with, the city now stands at a different crossroads of crime, politics, and protest. What began as a familiar battle between federal immigration agents and local activists to uproot illegal migration has now become part of a much larger war. This war is the type that involves gangs, cartels, and communities caught in the middle.
Trump! Fuck guys! Fuck 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 Trump!
Chicago gangs and cartels against ICE. In recent months, federal authorities intensified operations across the city, citing intelligence that major drug cartels were using Chicago as a supply chain center. The city's highways, warehouses, and ports have long made it a key distribution point for narcotics moving from Mexico to the country's Midwest. But the real deal has been going on behind the scenes. The drug business has skyrocketed with crucial help from another notable force. This is no other than the city's deep-rooted gang structure. From the south side to Cicero, gangs that have operated for decades are now entangled with cartel networks supplying drugs and weapons. Federal agents say that some of these groups have begun coordinating against enforcement units, using encrypted radios, lookouts, and counter-surveillance tactics to track ICE and border-related agents working within city limits. Reports even emerged of cartels placing cash bounties on the heads of ICE officers. These developments fueled an aggressive response from Washington. Operations were ramped up under new directives, with ICE and Homeland Security targeting what they called transnational criminal networks hidden inside immigrant communities. The raids have become larger, more visible, and more confrontational. But as federal enforcement grew heavier, so did public backlash. Across Chicago, thousands of residents gathered into the streets demanding that ICE leave their neighborhoods. The protests spread from the downtown core to suburban Broadview, where one of the largest federal immigration facilities in the Midwest sits. The protesters had accused the government of treating immigrant neighborhoods like war zones, where they willingly deployed helicopters, tactical vehicles, and even chemical agents in operations that often swept up ordinary residents. For many in Chicago's immigrant communities, the fear is not just about deportation anymore. It is now about living in an environment where raids, sirens, and arrests have become part of their daily life. Families in the city claim they feel trapped between two threats, which is the violence of gangs and cartels on one side and the heavy hand of federal enforcement on the other. Mayor Brandon Johnson's administration even responded with a significant step as he declared ICE-free zones across the city. The executive order barred federal immigration agents from using city-owned spaces like the parking lots, garages, and vacant land as staging grounds for their job.
But when they came in the middle of the night, they terrorized the families that were living there. There were children who were without clothing. They were zip-tied, taken outside at 3 o'clock in the morning. A senior resident, an American citizen, with no warrants, was taken outside and handcuffed for 3 hours. Doors were blown off their hinges, walls were broken through. Immigration agents coming from Black Hawk helicopters to set up snipers on nearby buildings.
Mayor Brandon Johnson's statement simply meant the city was tired of the constant harassment and that Chicago would control its own streets, not surrender them to federal operations. Some folks cheered the mayor as they saw the move as an act of courage, believing he took a stand for humanity in a city that has always embraced its immigrant roots. However, there are also the citizens that think it's a wrong move. These critics warned that limiting federal presence would make it harder to fight organized crime and cartels that are currently thriving in Chicago's underground economy. The tension between these two sides is far beyond any gang's regular retaliation beef against each other or cartels trying to own a drug corner. On one side are the gangs and cartels fighting to maintain their networks. On the other are the federal agents determined to shut them down. And in the middle stand the residents of the city who live with the constant echo of raids, arrests, and gunfire, and hoping each day they wake up will not be their last. As protests continue and violence escalates, the line between criminal pursuit and community protection grows ever thinner. Chicago's struggle has become more than a local issue, as it is gradually becoming a reflection of the broader American dilemma concerning how to balance security, justice, and humanity in a city where all three seem to be at war. The alliance of gangs and cartels against ICE. The fine lines of Chicago now seem to be slowly thinning out as the enforcement of ICE laws gets more complicated. This has led to the darker collaboration of the city's most feared associations. There is the unlikely alliance between the city's most entrenched gangs and the sprawling networks of Mexican cartels. These two have always been at arm's length, considering their transactional relationship from the past, which was solely built around drug distribution. The alliance has now gone past transactions as both sides have transitioned into a coordinated front against federal power. It all started in the early 2000s when the Chicago Police Department was no longer the greatest threat to gang leadership. The city had become one of the United States Drug Enforcement Administration's key distribution hubs for the Sinaloa cartel and its offshoots. From heroin to meth and even cocaine flowed into the city by truck, rail, and warehouse, and out again into Milwaukee, Detroit, and Minneapolis. The local gangs, starting from Black Disciples, Gangster Disciples, Latin Kings, and Vice Lords, became the cartel's middlemen. Each group maintained its own block wars and territorial rivalries. Still, money being the common denominator made everyone coexist easily, as long as insults were not directed towards each other and blood was not spilled aimlessly. An investigator from Cook County once said, "We started seeing the same product on both sides of rival neighborhoods. That told us the source had changed. It wasn't about territory anymore. It was about supply lines." While the cartel needed infrastructure like stash houses, couriers, and safe routes, the gangs, on the other hand, needed consistency and money. The partnership was convenient, and at first, strictly business. But as federal enforcement grew bolder, raiding safe houses, seizing shipments, and tracking encrypted phones, the old order of mutual suspicion turned into a united front. The cartels had always fought governments in Mexico. The Chicago gangs had always fought the police. When those enemies merged under the banner of federal law, especially ICE, so did their cooperation and resistance. The shift began quietly. In 2016, after a series of high-profile ICE operations that targeted both drug traffickers and undocumented migrants tied to cartel networks, communication lines between Chicago's gangs and Mexican operatives changed tone. Meetings were not just about sales any longer. The meetings now involved strategy. Some gang sets began using cartel resources to monitor ICE movements. They watched license plates, tracked unmarked vehicles, and went as far as identifying informants. The cartels, in return, began providing access to encrypted communication apps and even military-style training through intermediaries. It was no longer a city drug alliance. It graduated into an underworld collaboration, one that saw ICE not as a law enforcement agency, but as a disturbing force that was destroying their business. By 2018, intelligence reports from Chicago's federal field offices showed growing cooperation between gang cells traditionally hostile to one another. Members of Latin-based and black street gangs were reportedly attending the same meetings, facilitated by cartel delegates who preached mutual gain. Guns were shared, safe houses rotated, and a new form of discipline emerged. The unification of these two groups came from their instincts to survive. ICE's increasing overlap with DEA and Homeland Security operations blurred the lines between immigration raids and narcotics enforcement. Entire families connected to low-level dealers were detained or deported, drying up workforce and trust. Cartel representatives saw it as an assault on their United States body. Local gangs saw it as an assault on their neighborhoods. Behind raided warehouses on the south side and quiet corners of Cicero, encrypted phones buzzed with new directives. The message was simple. If they come for one of us, they come for all. The cooperation was rock solid, and it was beginning to work positively for the gangs and cartels. ICE losses to gangs and cartels. Chicago gangs and cartels finally made a headway with ICE as they started using their own strategies against them by having an enemy within. When the first ICE agent was ambushed outside a Chicago suburb in late 2018, it was treated as an unfortunate incident where a random act of violence in a city led to it. But inside the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, the chatter suggested something deeper. The hit was too precise, the timing too clean. The agent had been tracking a shipment linked to a Sinaloa-affiliated network. Hours later, his location was compromised, and two masked men approached his car before disappearing into the night.
This morning, tensions running high in multiple areas around President Trump's immigration crackdown. Overnight, Los Angeles County declaring a state of emergency in response to ICE raids. Officials voting to clear the way for financial assistance for residents they say have been negatively impacted by immigration raids. While in Chicago, clashes on the streets getting heated. Homeland Security says federal officers faced a hostile crowd after an undocumented immigrant rammed a Border Patrol vehicle while trying to flee an immigration operation.
It was obvious as the day that the law enforcement didn't want to admit that ICE operations in Chicago were being leaked. Sometimes the leaked information came from compromised insiders, sometimes by local intermediaries with ties to informants. The cartels had money, and Chicago's gangs had connections inside nearly every corner of the city's administrative system, from tow truck operators to low-level data technicians. Every time ICE moved, someone knew, and the fight became more intense. Corruption in Chicago wasn't new, but what made this era different was the precision with which gang cartel alliances exploited it. They operated more like intelligence agencies than criminal crews. Anonymous tip lines were flooded with decoys before actual raids. It was as if the underworld had developed its own counterintelligence department. One seasoned agent said quietly, "They were studying us like we studied them. Every move we made was mirrored back in real time." ICE had long used immigration charges to pressure cooperation among low-level operatives. That leverage was disappearing. With cartel support, many gang members could now vanish into elaborate underground networks stretching from Little Village to Guadalajara. Families were relocated, IDs replaced, communication rerouted through VPNs and proxy accounts. In short, the same tactics once used by counter-narcotics agents were now being used against them.
Threw objects at federal agents who deployed tear gas, exposing some in the crowd, including 13 Chicago police officers.
This type of escalation is what is going to cause harm. It's not the people of Chicago, but it's the federal agents.
It's the latest flare-up during the Trump administration's so-called Operation Midway Blitz. DHS posting this video celebrating 1,500 immigration-related arrests in the Chicago area since early September.
All of these cities, we want to clean them up.
But the dramatic confrontations come as Homeland Security officials are warning Mexican drug cartels are now offering cash bounties to target ICE officers and other federal agents.
But what truly alarmed federal investigators was how unified the response had become. Previously, an ICE arrest in a Latin King stronghold might be met with silence from the rival Black P. Stones. Now, word of such an arrest could trigger misinformation campaigns or retaliatory hits across unrelated neighborhoods. It wasn't gang unity in the traditional sense, it seemed like an operational solidarity. Raids grew larger, more militarized. Agents began using armored vehicles in residential neighborhoods, often without coordination with local police. To many residents, it looked less like enforcement and more like invasion. Gangs took advantage of the unlicensed way of ICE operation, and they began to brand themselves not just as criminal organizations, but as defenders of the community against federal overreach. Propaganda videos circulated on social media with blurred faces and slogans like "Protect the Block" or "No More Raids." The cartels knew the psychological value of public sympathy, and they coached their Chicago partners in using it. The line between politics and the underworld began to fade. In immigrant-heavy neighborhoods like Pilsen and Little Village, whispers spread that ICE was targeting entire blocks unfairly. The local gangs capitalized on that anger, positioning themselves as protectors even as they tightened their grip on the narcotics trade. Fear of federal action made silence a survival strategy for civilians. By 2020, reports indicated that ICE agents were facing coordinated obstruction in multiple operations, from vehicles blocking exits to false 911 calls and deliberate misinformation from residents. Each act was small on its own, but together they created a landscape where enforcement was no longer unilateral. ICE was operating inside enemy territory. Inside Chicago's federal command centers, analysts started referring to the phenomenon as the enemy within. The war wasn't on a border anymore. It was inside the very neighborhoods federal agencies were sworn to protect. Retaliation and resistance against ICE. The retaliation phase began with a single event of a raid on a West Side warehouse in early 2020. It was a routine narcotics operation, at least on paper, targeting a suspected meth distribution point linked to a cartel cell. But what agents didn't know was that the warehouse doubled as a coordination hub for several gang leaders and a logistics officer for the Sinaloa network. The seizure crippled a multi-million-dollar supply chain overnight. The response was immediate and violent. Within days, unmarked ICE vehicles were tailed through South Chicago. Anonymous threats appeared online, referencing badge numbers and home addresses. Then came the coordinated attacks, which were small at first, targeting informants and suspected collaborators. But by mid-2020, several low-profile hits on law enforcement-linked personnel hinted at something bigger. The cartels had taught Chicago's gangs the art of how to make small strikes that carry big messages. A single assault on an agent could ruin an entire operation. A leaked address could silence an informant network. The aim wasn't to destroy ICE outrightly, but to make the cost of enforcement unbearable.
Threw objects at federal agents who deployed tear gas, exposing some in the crowd, including 13 Chicago police officers.
This type of escalation is what is going to cause harm. It's not the people of Chicago, but it's the federal agents.
It's the latest flare-up during the Trump administration's so-called Operation Midway Blitz. DHS posting this video celebrating 1,500 immigration-related arrests in the Chicago area since early September.
All of these cities, we want to clean them up.
But the dramatic confrontations come as Homeland Security officials are warning Mexican drug cartels are now offering cash bounties to target ICE officers and other federal agents.
For years, law enforcement operated with no protection in the city's most dangerous neighborhoods. But after the attacks, agents moved in convoys, avoided routine routes, and were warned never to return home in the same vehicle twice. Paranoia became a procedure. Inside ICE's Chicago field office, their morale and coordination was shaken because everyone wanted to return home to their families in one piece. Meanwhile, the gangs and cartels adapted their communication and tactics. Using the same encrypted channels that had shielded their supply lines, they began coordinating retaliatory plans. Not every gang agreed on how far to take it, as some feared bringing the full weight of federal power onto their neighborhoods. But the dominant sentiment was clear, as they all agreed that the government had drawn first blood. That was the mindset fueling the resistance. For every raid ICE launched, the response became sharper of intel leaks, property attacks, and harassment of agents. Federal task forces scrambled to isolate cells, but the gangs had learned the cartel model well, which was to decentralize, disguise, disappear.
Bless these hoes on my dick cause I'm fly like a jet. They gon' be surprised when they see I made this beat, baby Chief and Kanye West. As long as the hoe outside with the zoo shit never see home. 26.
And in the background, the cartels continued to fund and guide. They supplied the weapons, the communication tools, and sometimes even the propaganda. The collaboration that had started as an economic alliance had evolved into a shared identity of defiance against federal control. The silent war between ICE and gangs and cartels. The summer of 2021 marked the beginning of what law enforcement would quietly label the silent war. There were no public declarations, no televised confrontations, only a slow escalation of disappearances, assassinations, and digital sabotage. The battleground was not the streets of Englewood or Little Village anymore. It changed to data, secrecy, and psychology. In neighborhoods where ICE once conducted raids openly, agents now relied on undercover operations that often ended without arrests. The city's gangs had restructured their networks under cartel supervision, breaking large organizations into smaller, harder-to-trace cells. Each cell had limited knowledge of the others, mimicking the operational discipline of paramilitary groups. The cartels had always been experts at compartmentalization. They brought those methods north, training gang lieutenants in security, finance, and intelligence. By late 2021, encrypted communications replaced most physical meetings. Drop points were relocated weekly. Cars were equipped with counter-surveillance jammers. When ICE agents began to vanish from ongoing investigations, some reassigned without explanation, others targeted by doxing attacks, and rumors spread through federal channels of deep infiltration. Confidential informants were either compromised or killed. At least 2 high-level leaks traced back to Chicago resulted in raids being canceled at the last minute. Inside Homeland Security's Chicago office, Internal Affairs began investigating its own members. The cartels and gangs were watching. They had long understood that fear fractures institutions faster than violence. From 2022, the pattern became unmistakable. As information went missing, surveillance footage was erased and investigations collapsed without evidence. ICE leadership tried to blame procedural errors, but analysts privately described a deliberate campaign of disruption. In the streets, the tension turned psychological. In immigrant-dominated districts, ICE was no longer viewed as a protector of law and order, but as an aggressor operating under political motive. That public sentiment was shaped partly by cartel-backed community influencers and made federal agents hesitant. Each operation risked backlash, protests, or worse, leaked footage that could ruin reputations. The gangs understood the value of optics. They ensured that for every weapon, there was a camera waiting to expose federal mistakes.
A car chase through a Chicago neighborhood ended in a crash. ICE agents say the driver was an illegal immigrant trying to flee arrest. Residents at the scene began throwing eggs and rocks at the agents, who in turn fired tear gas to disperse the crowd. The incident highlights the growing risks for federal officers. The Homeland Security Department is reporting Mexican cartels are now offering cash rewards.
This manipulation of public narrative became the alliance's strongest weapon. Local crews filmed ICE vehicles idling outside homes and shared the videos on social media with captions like, "They came for our families again." In hours, such posts amassed hundreds of thousands of views. The digital war had replaced the open one. Within this ecosystem, cartel influence expanded quietly but absolutely. Money laundering shifted to crypto transactions. Communication migrated to dark web channels and closed community forums disguised as cultural networks. The cartels no longer needed to import their operations from Mexico because they had built a self-sustaining empire in Chicago's underworld. And still, bodies dropped. Not in shootouts, but in quiet precision. Informants, suspected collaborators, mid-level suppliers who cooperated with ICE, all found dead under unremarkable circumstances. Some disappeared altogether. A local journalist investigating the network said off-camera, this wasn't street violence. It was methodical, clean, silent, professional. You could feel the shift. It wasn't about drugs anymore. It was about control. Inside the city, that adaptation looked like normalization. Violence fell in some neighborhoods, not because the crime stopped, but because it was regulated. The cartels enforced discipline. Unapproved shootings meant death. Cooperation with law enforcement meant exile or worse. For many residents, it was safer to live under cartel-coordinated gangs than under the chaos that preceded them. The silent war had created order through fear. ICE had the law, but the streets had the loyalty of those who no longer trusted it. The future of the Chicago gangs and cartels alliance. By 2023, Chicago was no longer a battlefield in the traditional sense. The open defiance that characterized the early years of the conflict had evolved into something more systemic. The city's gangs, once fragmented and impulsive, had become the operational arms of a larger, disciplined structure guided by cartel economics and political calculation. This structure wasn't just about drugs anymore. It was about influence, control, and survival within a city where federal reach was viewed as both omnipresent and detached. Even as ICE continued to issue statements about successful operations and progress in dismantling trafficking networks, the reality on the ground has been telling a different story. For every arrest, there were 10 new recruits. For every intercepted shipment, 3 more slipped through unrecorded. The cartels had diversified into legitimate businesses, including construction, trucking, import-export, turning parts of Chicago's economy into their camouflage. The city's institutions, already strained by political division, found themselves negotiating with forces they couldn't officially acknowledge. Developers, unions, and small business associations unknowingly entered contracts tied to laundered capital. Cartel money has been cleaning itself through civic progress. Meanwhile, ICE struggled to redefine its role. The agency's focus has shifted toward cyber operations, tracing financial flows instead of bodies. By 2024, things have changed so much that the gangs are not hiding from federal power anymore. They have woven themselves into the city's very systems, and for the cartels, Chicago has become less a hub than a model. It is now a demonstration that with enough money, strategy, and community leverage, even the most powerful government agencies could be contained. The gangs now use street cameras to monitor movements, not to prevent crime, but to protect their networks. The city has become a closed loop of watchers and the watched, where authority has been decentralized and enforcement comes without warrants. And yet, despite all of this, the government's response has remained bureaucratic. It is always about reports, audits, and reassignments. The cartels know time is their greatest ally. Public memory fades, agencies reorganize, political priorities shift. Each delay has been a victory. By mid-2025, Chicago's criminal alliance operated under what insiders called the grid, a loosely connected but meticulously coordinated system that linked street distributors, financial operatives, digital hackers, and corrupt officials into one self-sustaining organism.
But when they came in the middle of the night, they terrorized the families that were living there. There were children who were without clothing. They were zip-tied, taken outside at 3 o'clock in the morning. A senior resident, an American citizen, with no warrants, was taken outside and handcuffed for 3 hours. Doors were blown off their hinges, walls were broken through. Immigration agents coming from Black Hawk helicopters to set up snipers on nearby buildings. This is America. One resident described the situation plainly, and I quote, "They had immigrants in one van and black people in another van."
However, there are raids, arrests, and conferences filled with confident statements. But the city's pulse has been telling another story where the gangs and cartels have adapted beyond punishment. They are no longer just surviving, they are evolving. From the alleys of South Chicago to the quiet boardrooms of suburban fronts, the war that began in blood is slowly maturing into an economy. And perhaps this may be the final victory of the gangs and cartels' underworld. It seems their aim is not to destroy its enemy, but to outlast it. The streets of Chicago reacts. By late 2025, Chicago's war with ICE was no longer confined to the shadows. What began with the gangs and cartels had spilled into the open streets. The same neighborhoods once policed by underground networks now moved in daylight, driven not by crime, but by outrage. When ICE launched Operation Midway Blitz, it was meant to reclaim control. Instead, it united the city against them. From Little Village to Pilsen, thousands poured into the streets, carrying banners instead of weapons, voices instead of bullets. Their chants echoed the same defiance that had long fueled the underground. "We won't be hunted." The cartels watched quietly as the protests unfolded. They didn't need to move. The people were now doing what their operations had once done in silence, challenging federal reach. The government had drawn battle lines, and the city, from its criminal underworld to its working-class corners, had answered with one message: Chicago protects its own. Tear gas drifted through Broadview. Cameras caught the chaos. For years, the gangs had waged a secret war against ICE. Now, the public had joined it, not with weapons or fear, but with presence. In the rhythm of protest drums and the glare of riot lights, the cycle was complete. What began in the underworld had risen to the surface. Chicago is no longer just resisting in silence. It is speaking, marching, and forcing the nation to listen. Churches that once served as quiet sanctuaries of worship are now doubling as safe havens for immigrant families. Many have opened their doors to those afraid of raids, offering shelter, legal help, and meals. Inside these makeshift sanctuaries, pastors preach not just faith, but courage. Youth organizations across the South and West Sides have also stepped in to fill the vacuum left by fractured trust in law enforcement. Programs like after-school mentorships, street art projects, and job training are being used to pull young people away from the gravitational pull of the gangs. Leaders say they are trying to give teens a reason to believe that their future doesn't have to be defined by the block they live on. Faith leaders have become some of the city's most vocal advocates, challenging both gangs and the government. They condemn the bloodshed that rips through their streets, but also the policies that make their people feel hunted. To them, true peace will not come from more raids or stricter enforcement, but from rebuilding trust and opportunity. Meanwhile, Mayor Brandon Johnson's administration has begun working with advocacy groups to balance enforcement with humanity. The city's new sanctuary initiatives and the creation of ICE-free zones have drawn both praise and anger, but they have also sparked a vital conversation about what safety really means in a city like Chicago. As the war between gangs, cartels, and federal agents continues to unfold, these local heroes remain Chicago's quiet front line. Their struggle is not about power, but about survival and the belief that even in a city divided by violence and politics, humanity can still hold its ground.